It's been a rough week over at Sony, with their recently announced closure of Bluepoint, a studio that was well known for its remakes and remasters across the board being pretty much universally acclaimed. Sony really haven't made it better for themselves. They really haven't. Sony did rub some kind of salt in the wound with a tweet several days later asking what games people would like to see remastered. And yes, it was over on PlayStation's German socials, but it feels like somebody needs to tell them that the internet is this worldwide thing. And, you know, people talk. While I know most of PlayStation socials took almost a 72-hour hiatus away from the social media regarding the pretty significant reaction to Bluepoint's closure, this obviously was not a great PR point. Before we get down too deep, there was also the very recent state of play, and I'm sure many people, including myself, were very, very surprised that we didn't see the Wolverine game shown off here, because it's due out later this year. This is kind of where it starts to get a bit spicy. Shortly after the news broke about the closure of Bluepoint, a tweet went live confirming Wolverine's release date, and it's going to be September 15th, so get your sick notes ready, guys. It's going to be cracking. This news, while exciting and welcome, it feels a bit like there was a lot of angry fans on the social media, like I said, kind of expected if you're going to close a studio that many people thought was going to remake Bloodborne, but of course they wouldn't have been interested in doing such a thing. Oh damn, I was wrong. So over the last year, since the cancellation of Bluepoint's live service game, because apparently they had a great time working on as a support for God of War Ragnarok, they'd been pitching a variety of different projects, some of which are remakes and remasters of some different kind. This seems to have been across the board. There was a spin-off of Ghost of Tsushima apparently suggested too. We now know that they pitched the holy grail of remakes we have been begging for, Bloodborne. And this is where it gets complicated. Now, the Bloodborne IP ownership is kind of odd. While it was developed by FromSoft, it was pitched to them by the now defunct studio, Japan Studios, which was owned by Sony. And for all intents and purposes, was developed in collaboration and supervised by Japan Studios. So Sony obviously took that lead situation. So the IP is owned by Sony. Sony is also the major shareholder from FromSoft's parent company, while also being a shareholder in FromSoft directly, while albeit a minority one, it's still about 10%, I think. And so it gets a very complicated setup very, very quickly. But from what we gather, Sony told Bluepoint that FromSoft wouldn't approve of it. So it's kind of unclear if the idea made it to FromSoft, and then there's a lot of schools of thought around this, namely, Miyazaki has made it very clear he'd love to remake the game himself, but he's been too busy. And then, of course, there's the elephant in the room, the Demon's Souls remake. The Demon's Souls remake, while it did receive universal acclaim, has been somewhat contentious, particularly around its changes in art direction. If I had to work out why this could be divided between some of the original fans who played it back on the PS3 and some of the newer fans who played it as the Dark Souls trilogy, and particularly with Elden Ring. We just got to remember that Elden Ring came out after Demon's Souls, but did bring a lot of new fans in, and naturally they would have played the game that was the easiest one to access. And at the time, if you owned a PS5, the Demon's Souls remake is particularly easy to access. Overall, we weren't aware that FromSoft had any direct thoughts about the Demon's Souls remake. Now, there was speculation, as there naturally is, but we know the fans were pretty mixed about that. But there have been a lot of talk about FromSoft not being happy with the art direction, and the more we look at it, you can understand why. In fairness, some of the enemy designs were changed away, given a more horror aesthetic, and slightly westernized. Bluepoint made these decisions without FromSoft's approval. We don't know why they made these choices, and whether you like them or not, particularly if you played the original and you played the new version, you will have stronger opinions on this. If you don't know any different, then you wouldn't necessarily notice the changes. I do think there was a lot of different factors at play, and while FromSoft may not have directly shot down this Bloodborne remake, it's likely Sony wanted to avoid upsetting the FromSoft team, and in turn, Miyazaki, as they want to not just continue their working relationship with each other, but Sony also holds significant stakes in them and doesn't necessarily want to hinder that relationship. And I'm sure if Miyazaki announced tomorrow he'd be remaking Bloodborne himself, it would probably sell leaps and bounds more copies than just a Bloodborne remake that had nothing to do with him. Because at the end of the day, the owner of the IP and the call was Sony's. FromSoft don't necessarily get a massive say in whether Sony remake it or not, but Sony do want to play nice with FromSoft for a multitude of reasons. From hopefully getting exclusives, to having a really good working relationship, to also just generally respecting the source material, because Souls-like fans are pretty vocal. That's a fact. I love the Souls-like genre. We're a specific bunch. FromSoft might have something up their sleeves that they want to work on around that property themselves. And I mean, look at Duskbloods. Duskbloods is very Bloodborne coded. While yes, it's a Nintendo Switch exclusive, it does seem strange at how similar it is in style, despite it obviously being player versus environment. So it's so clear that FromSoft love that aesthetic. So it's honestly anyone's guess the exact reason why that was shut down. Because at the moment, there's so much to speculate, because there's a multitude of reasons that it could be. But none of them necessarily answer the question. And overall, it's a massive shame that we're not getting a Bloodborne remaster anytime soon, and look, it's a very noticeable example of how much politics is involved in game development, way more than we ever thought. But Bluepoint are a massive victim in this. They got caught in this crossfire of politics. Sony haven't really been doing any favors recently. They've rolled back on PC ports for single-player games, which could have infected Bluepoint as well. Sony are very much looking at numbers when it comes to their remake and remasters, and obviously they didn't seem to think a lot of their games were worth the time. Bluepoint pitched another Shadow of Colossus remake, which probably was just an updated version of what they already made back on the PS4, which didn't necessarily feel needed, but I feel like at that point, they were just clutching at straws to just keep themselves working. But I also think there's plenty of different games they could have remade. You go back through all of Sony's different properties, they have a multitude of them. Infamous is one of the few games on the PS3 era that they haven't remade and is not available to play properly on a modern day console. You could stream it, but that's fun, I guess. I think we'd all rather be able to play it just natively, but that's a whole different thing from PS3 emulation, and that's a whole different topic. Right, that is a whole series. That's 2 games that just never made it over to the leaked PS4. Most of the games got a remake. They got pushed up. But that Infamous didn't. That would have been a great example of a series that probably Sucker Punch didn't want to go back near because they're too busy with other series, particularly the Ghost of Tsushima series, right? That's the issue. There were so many options, and that's just me thinking of one off the top of my head. I could go down the rabbit hole of more obscure titles, like Siphon Filter, which was Sony Ben's property that they brought into Sony and got them hired in the first place. And then that's even down to the point that Sony Ben were the other company. Sony Ben were also working on a live service game, and that's scary. If Bluepoint, Bend could be next. And that should worry everyone. And that doesn't matter if you liked Ben's properties or not. I know not lots of people like Days Gone. It was a solid experience, but probably I played it on PS5, so I had the luxury of higher frame rates. If they're prepared to close Bluepoint because they weren't able to get another game, what news is that to all the people working at Sony Ben? Because if they haven't got a good enough pitch, then they could be next. And that's going to sting. Sony are wasting a lot of talent, and that is an absolute shambles. And look, at the end of the day, I hope we get to see a Bloodborne remake one day. And I think without FromSoft, it's looking more and more unlikely. But I don't know. What do you guys think? Let me know down in the comments. Was Sony just being cautious and FromSoft just being protective? Or is there something else going on behind the scenes we just don't know about yet? It's probably a little bit of everything. But please remember to like and subscribe to the video. And if you want to check me out over on Twitch, I'm live there 4 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday. And I'm also live sometimes here. You can find me over on Twitch at twitch.tv/the_untitledgamer. And for now, bye!